Welcome. I'm Dr. Lisa Toppin, and you have joined Inputs to Action. I'm excited to have you join today. We are talking to H.D. Kirkpatrick. He is the author of Mars, a psychological portrait of the Southern slave master and his legacy of white supremacy. This is the book. Get it in camera. This is the book. I think that's an extraordinary cover. And Dee, we are delighted to have you and excited for this conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So important work, and there's so much to talk about. But I'd love to just start with getting a sense of you. I've had the pleasure of knowing you, but I would love the audience to hear your background and who you are and what you've been doing and why this book.
Well, I'll try to be brief with all that. I'm a native Charlottean. Uh, uh, I left Charlotte for two segments of my life, one to go to college in Boston, another 13 years spent in the Bay Area of California. Uh, but I got a scholarship to Harvard, where I got an undergraduate degree in fine arts, then a master's in guidance and counseling at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and then a doctorate in psychology from Saybrook University in San Francisco. And then I began to specialize in forensic psychology and got advanced training in that at the California School of Professional Psychology in Berkeley. And I went on to practice clinical and forensic psychology for approximately 35 years, uh, and was still doing such when my black brother, cousin, high school classmate came to me with the surprising news that he had discovered through his own genealogic research that a fellow named Hugh Kirkpatrick had owned his great great grandfather in slavery here in Mecklenburg County. And Jimmy asked me what the H in my name stood for, and I said Hugh. And then, long story short, what unfolded was he took me into a history and the documentation that showed that Hugh Kirkpatrick, my great great grandfather and my namesake, uh, owned 30, 31 slaves or more on the eve of the Civil War, which made him a pretty significant player in Mecklenburg County as far as slaveholding.
Yeah, and so that is an extraordinary, I'm sure, an extraordinary find. And you and Jimmy knew each other in high school, but had no idea of this deep connection.
Yeah, I really didn't know him very well. Jimmy was a rock star. He was an extraordinary football player, and so my relationship with Jimmy was just one of admiration and awe at watching how skillful he was uh, every Friday night on a football field. But he and I never became friends. We just were aware of having the same last names, but never really discussed it during that time till 45 years went by.
Yeah. And what was that like for you when he took you into all of the research that revealed that your family had owned slaves and in fact had owned his family um, from that perspective?
Well, it was pretty shocking, quite frankly. Uh, Surprising because there had never been a hint of any slaveholding in any of the narrative within my family, but maybe just not with me. I don't know. Uh, uh, we were uh, clearly dairy farmers and had some pretty significant dairy farming enterprises in Mecklenburg County. Uh, so I think the real possibility is that our family was engaged in growing of cotton and dairy farming very early on, and used increasing number of slaves to uh, you know provide free labor for those enterprises.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so it's important, and it's you very rarely hear people talk about and or acknowledge that kind of history in their families. So I think it's helpful that's a part of your story that you're sharing. So you've written this book, and I do think that this is really an important work that we're going to be talking about for years to come, and that probably every African American studies class, I'm going to go so far as to say history class, probably will take on, because of where you go with it. But you've really sort of taken it on to unpack the question of how a person can justify to himself of owning another human being as property. How do you justify that as morally and ethically acceptable? So why was this, from your perspective, such an important question to answer?
Well, because uh, have known in my heart for a long time that slavery was uh, wrong. It was a crime against humanity. Uh, and the more I got into understanding Southern slavery, which was slavery based on the color of a person's skin, I began to realize that that was not true across the history of the world. Even though slavery has existed for thousands of years, uh, chattel slavery based on the color of a person's skin was something that was new and different and more insidious. Uh, so I wanted to try to understand that, especially uh, given that I had learned my own family's history. Uh, I didn't really set out to write a book about my ancestors. Uh, but that's perhaps a book of another day. And if I did that, I'd do it with Jimmy because we'd have that shared history. This is more looking at a class of slaveholders from 1830 to 1861, um, and men and some women who owned 30 or more slaves, which put them into what's called the planter class. And I wanted to understand that as best I could, uh, and decided I could paint a portrait. I have a fine arts history background. Uh, and I thought, well, who am I to say what white slave masters look like? It's They are subjects by a lot of people have written about. Um, but I thought, well, if I take the metaphor of a portrait, then I can paint what I see, which is what I've done. And then I took my psychological training and decided that I could do essentially what amounted to a psychological autopsy uh, by going back and looking at the behaviors uh, of the slave masters towards the enslaved and get a clear picture, not what the slave masters said. Uh, for example, common mythology, if you will, was that slaves are a part of our family. Everybody's content. All is good on the home front. Uh, we're helping these people. They appreciate all the efforts that we provide them, et cetera, which is just total nonsense. But that's what they created, and began to realize that there were a lot of delusions uh, and defense mechanisms that I could use to apply to these folks in retrospect that would help make sense out of what they did,
Mhm.
behavior, which in many cases is just horrible. There's a couple of chapters in Mars that are not easy reading because of the look at the methods and procedures that white slave masters used to dominate, control, and punish their enslaved people.
Hmm. And so, I'm appreciating this connection because as a forensic psychologist, this is sort of the work that you have been doing, in the course of your career, is sort of painting a portrait of a person who's on trial for something. You're trying to go into their psychology and sort of explain or understand their state of mind. Is that an accurate way of saying that? Is that sort of you're taking your sort of your present approach and applying it historically?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. My my goal as a forensic psychologist was to provide as balanced and accurate a picture of a person's state of mind or rationale for their actions or whatever to the referral source, which was either an attorney or a court of law.
Okay, that I think that's helpful context because now you're talking about the defense mechanisms that they might have employed. So say more about that. What kind of defense mechanisms would they have used?
Well, I think like all human beings, we all use them. You know, we all denial is probably one of the more popular defense mechanisms. You know, like I'm fine. My leg's not really hurting. You know, I'm not putting on more weight than I'm good. I don't need to be bothered by this ailment.
Mhm.
You know, whatever. And then there are defense mechanisms that I believe were idiosyncratic to slaveholding itself. Uh, and let me give you an example of that. Uh, the South became convinced that God was on the side of the South and that God was going to forsake the North in the Civil War. The South was convinced that it had the firepower and the manpower to develop its own country
Mm.
and go up against the United States. The South believed that France and England would come to support the South in its effort to establish the South as the Confederate States of America, a separate country from the rest of America. The South believed through its amazing repetitive stance taken by the evangelical white clergy that uh, God had ordained slavery and given it to the South as a gift, as something to be nurtured, and that uh, building the country as wealthy and powerful as the southern states became before the war was manifest evidence that you know the, the South was doing God's work. And I spent a lot of time in that vein trying to understand that distortion of religion that I think was a huge part of the defense mechanisms that the Southerners used to deceive themselves
Mhm.
and lead the country to a disastrous war.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that this is such an important part of the conversation because what you've done is expanded our understanding, or you're giving us an opportunity to expand what we understand about these slaveholders because we have historically we've just dismissed it as evil. And I think what I'm taking from Mars is there's more to it than just evil. There is that element. It was evil, but it was more complex than that in terms of the psychology of the slaveholders. You're talking about these defense mechanisms, not unlike we all use denial at some point. Uh, in our lives. And so this was huge denial in terms of what this meant, and or how they were defining what they believed, and sort of and how they went forward with it, reconciling it, as I would say, in terms of their own mind, to make this okay. um so do you think that um laying before us this complexity makes it easier for us to sort of enter this conversation with less defense? I think historically, or and even now in our country, we're struggling with having the conversation, appreciating that there's more complexity than perhaps we have known and or paid attention to. Does that make it easier, do you think, for us to have the conversation?
I'd be kidding myself if I said, yeah, not a problem. Uh, I think it's going to depend on the person, on the particular reader. Uh, and, you know, I think some Black folks are going to have trouble with the book because it's painful.
Hmm.
Uh, I think some white folks are going to have trouble because it's painful, because it portrays them and their ancestors in a not so pretty light. Uh, I think that it takes Mars takes a definite uh, democratic turn, capital D, in chapter 11 and in the epilogue, because I finished the book, chapter 11, in October of 2020, and then the election happened, and then January 6th happened, and I wrote an epilogue that draws a straight through line from mid 19th century white supremacists to the Trump White House.
Mm.
And so I think if somebody is really a dyed in the wool Trumpster, they're going to be offended or take great issue with some of what I write about in the epilogue. But that's, again, it's my portrait. That's how I saw it.
Hmm.
And, sitting there in front of the TV January 6th, watching, the attack, and watching the rebel battle flag being carried in the Capitol, it
Hmm.
just kind of, cinched that for me as where I think we're headed. Unfortunately, is the lost cause of the South has gotten second wind, quite frankly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate your calling that out, because in the start of the book, you call out that your intention as a researcher really is to go um, in a, I'm going to say, in a formal way. You're looking to call out the good and the bad, and you acknowledge, as a good researcher would do, that you do have bias against slavery. You see it as a terrible thing, and so. That's what you do in research, is that you acknowledge what biases you may have, that may color the work and make that plain for anybody picking it up. And you're still doing that by calling out the I'm going to say the political leaning at the end of the book, with the epilogue, and how you're seeing that. So I think that's an important piece. Um, do you think so? So let's go into this psychology, if you will, because you talked about the fact, obviously, that it was more than financial. So that, we would, initially we would sort of say, well, they did it to make money, or the financial advantage of having free labor. Um, but or it was just evil, so it was just racist, and so that was piece of it. But what else makes up the psychology of the slave master? How could we understand that?
Well, again, just to emphasize this point, as a psychologist, I learned early on that uh, to really understand a human being, you need to pay attention to what he or she does,
Hmm.
not what they say. Uh, so that was what was important, is focusing on the behavior of the slave masters, the Southern slave masters. And so what I did, and I'll just do this quickly, is Marsh has got 11 chapters. I did a brief sketch of the Southern slave master. I did a look at the core assumptions and beliefs that they held about Black Africans. I looked at a surprising cohort of slave masters were female that one of my mentors on this book encouraged me to look at. And I was kind of shocking to see the strength of these women, even though they were a small, small minority within the slaveholding world. Then I go into great depth about the multiple defense mechanisms, both healthy and pathologic, that slaveholders used. I go, as I said earlier, into a fairly deep dive about the use of religion as a defense of slavery. Mm-hmm. And that's significant because pro-slavery folks went up against the abolitionists, which were making a pretty good effort to dwell on the evil and horrors of slavery. But they lost the religious debate. The South won that debate and kind of hammered the abolitionists into a corner because it put them at the risk of having to attack the Bible, where the Southern slave masters derived great support for slavery as a source. On that point, I take a long look at Noah and after the flood and how slave masters and their ministers managed to sort it out and turn one of Noah's sons into a heathen, a black man, and was relegated by a curse to go off into Africa and into, a very subhuman existence. Then I look at what a lot of people don't talk so much about because it was such a great system of denial, but it's the fear that gripped the South. Got something covering up my... Slaveholders were deeply afraid of their slaves, but didn't admit it, and went to great efforts to pretend that everything was good and that they had it all under control. But if you could just imagine, a situation where, you're a extraordinarily wealthy white slave master running a rice plantation down, say, South Carolina, you've got 1,100 slaves imprisoned, in barracks, essentially guarded by prison guards. And you might have to travel for business to another part of the country or even to Europe. And so you leave your family in such a circumstance. Imagine your wife and children, the fear that they would have naturally from such a circumstance, but ignoring it, trying to pretend it wasn't true. And that, to me, undoubtedly caused a great deal of difficulty. The slave masters, one of the worst, well, there's so many worst. One of the worst was their presumption of entitlement, of sexual assault and rape of slave girls and slave women, and saw no problems with that. Didn't seem to care about its impact on the slave family, on the assaulted person, but also on the slave master's own wife and children to 9-10 months later, suddenly have a light-skinned child show up, a product of the master and the enslaved girls' union assault, and that happens so much in the South. But it's part of the psychopathology of the slave master, because he felt like he was entitled and he owned and he would receive no negative repercussions from such outlandish behavior.
Yeah, not and to that end, not even within the family, like the family, obviously, either through their own denial system, accepted that too. Um,
Well, yeah, with in that chapter about the Southern female slaveholders, I discovered it was borne out by the history is that they were often uh, exhibiting a crueler behavior towards their enslaved than their husbands.
yeah,
And so I go into the psychology of that because I think that, it made sense to me that a white female who saw the black mammy being more affectionate and more loving towards her children than she was,
hmm
uh, becoming pretty enraged about that.
yeah,
Or the husband suddenly showing up with this attractive young black female that he purchased in the market to have now at his disposal in the family, that would enrage her, and she might take that out on other enslaved people. So that's a side of this that some of it is hypothetical or theoretical, but it seemed to psychologically make sense.
it does make sense. I mean, and again, to your point, this is not a part of the conversation that we've really gone into. And I think it's an important conversation because as we fast forward to the relationship of white women and black women, there has been tension over the years. Just we're looking for and continuing to find those places where we can collectively support each other as women and hurdle um, the race dynamic, and as you're describing, there's some vestiges probably that we need to work through.
Yeah, yeah,
So wow, okay. I mean, again, again, this, I'm telling you, this work is going to be important for some time, just because of all of the pieces that you're giving us. Okay, so one thing that I thought was interesting and that I did not know is that most white Southerners did not own slaves. So only a fourth of them did. And it was seen as a status symbol. And so I'm making some parallels to today, in terms of status symbols that we see. So the rich and the powerful have, big houses and fancy cars that most of us don't have. And then most of us aspire to at least have, I'm going to say, the access in a way that allows us the choice. Whether or not we buy that or not is a different thing, but we want we'd be drawn to the status of what that is. How did the status of slave ownership impact the community and or its support or popularity? Was that does that did it I guess what I'm getting is, did slave holding as a status symbol, did it impact that community in the same way that status symbols impact us today?
well, I think so. Again, I'm not even sure that the number of slaveholders was as high as one fourth when you get
Mm,
into the upper echelons of serious slaveholding, like people that owned 500,
mm,
1,000 enslaved people. There's a small number of men, mostly, uh, but they were very powerful politically and militarily. Uh, the first eight presidents of the United States were in that group. Thomas Jefferson himself owned 300 slaves. Uh, but I think for the average Southerner, the possibility of owning a slave was always there. It would certainly be a status symbol. So there are a lot of uh, Southerners that were not very rich, small farms that might have one or two slaves uh, helping them, and they worked alongside them. But the ones that I really focused on in Mars are uh, men, majority of whom were men, who were believing that they were just the elite at the top of the white caste, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it was their destiny to lead this country into becoming the most powerful uh, nation in the world, and driven by a free labor uh, machine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I am appreciating that you're calling out our first 8 presidents, because we don't often call that out either. In real acknowledgement, I mean, we sort of struggle, and I think we've held them separate and apart from this system, and just important, I think, in our healing and our path forward, to acknowledge that, yes, the men who formed this country, who wrote the Constitution and all of the formation, were massive slaveholders. So that's context that's important to have, I think. Um, One thing I thought was interesting was that you talk about psychopathy, and that being a something that shows up in slaveholding. Is that something that sort of, is that a part of the way the mind sort of finds reconciliation, and does that pass down? Say more about that.
Well, uh, the psychopath is a very strange creature in the human experience. It's a rare disorder, quite frankly. Uh, but I believe slaveholding among white masters uh, uh, developed a psychopathic attitude and set of behaviors because uh, he or she could not afford to empathize with their enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they could not afford to be conscious of the pain, the agony, the rage that was created by the objective circumstances of having stolen people, brought them to a new place, forced them into labor for the rest of their lives, constantly seeing many of them attempt to run away, and somehow creating their own mind that everything was okay.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and a certain cruelty would evolve out of the psychopathy because in one of the chapters, I think it's uh, probably chapter 9 thereabouts, um, I go into the methods that slaveholders used to control and punish and dominate, and it's pretty horrible. The
Mm-hmm.
the range of methods that were used from thrashing all the way up to lynching and burning was just an extraordinary display of cruel punishment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the cruel punishment. Well, you just mentioned lynching, and one of the things I noticed in your discussion early was your acknowledgement of George Floyd as a lynching, and so sort of falling into that extreme and or cruel punishment, maybe because Derek Chauvin showed no empathy.
Well, and he was also taking the law into his own hands. He
Mm,
was consciously or not, he was engaged in the execution of a black man by force, uh, with a lot of people watching, which a lynching was often surrounded by lots of observers,
mhm,
uh, but certainly not exhibiting any consciousness of guilt or uh, any empathy towards what he was doing
mhm.
towards George Floyd. And so I'm not the first person who initially described Chauvin's actions as a lynching, but when I heard that, it certainly made sense to me.
Hmm. Well, the I'm going to say the historical context that you put around it in terms of the elements that make it a lynching, I think, is important to call out. Um, So you have, at the start of your book, you talked about your intention to apply forensic methodology, which requires that you look at the good, the bad, and obviously call out the bias. And we've acknowledged that. And I'm wondering, and this is a just an interesting question, but did you find good? Because I mean, we're talking about slavery, so there was a lot of bad to find. But did you find any good?
Well, yeah, I'd have to say yes, and I think the best example is, even though I previously today described the first 8 presidents of the United States as being slaveholders, uh, you know, many, if not most of those men did some very good things to develop the United States. So it would be a huge error to just dismiss, if you own or enslave another human being, there's no goodness in you. That's just simply not true. But the position of owning another person to support your good endeavors, that seems to me to be a contradiction. And in Mars, I don't really cut people much slack when uh, they're making a whole lot of money off the backs of enslaved people.
Yeah. Well, I'm appreciating that, because we often struggle with the fact that of that dichotomy, that good, it can exist along with bad. It often does in human beings. People do good things and then they do bad things. Some people do extremely bad things and some good things. So that is, again, sort of the complexity that shows up here, and I think in some ways does allow us to have more conversation about it than just running away from the fact that it was bad without um, elements that exist today, like the establishment of our government and our democracy, um, as some good that emerged from people who were significant slaveholders and benefited from this system.
Well, and I would add that you know uh, a lot of our infrastructure of our country
Mhm.
was built by slave labor. Um, and so you look around, a lot of colleges and universities are undergoing a kind of uh, reconciliation or a deep dive into their slavery history, and are shocked to find out just how deep and wide the use of enslaved labor was to establish, what are now, the considered some of the best colleges and universities in the world.
And just by dates alone, it would have to be, knowing that some of these schools are established in the 1600s. How else did they get built? I mean, I'm going to say that's a fairly easy leap, but I'm glad that they're starting to explore it. And I remember hearing about a school in DC sort of reconciling the fact that they were slaveholders and sold slaves and to finance their part of their experience. So I know there's for sure some reconciling going on. This is, again, we could talk about this for a long time. There's so much here. There's such a good book, an important work. I thank you so much. As we close, one of the things I always ask my guests, that this has been fantastic, a great input. What action would you have us now take? Now, I'm going to say right out the back, I'm going to say you got to go you got to go get this book. Get in the camera. You got to go get this book, because I think just in terms of um, going deep and understanding more will be life changing in many respects, in terms of what you believe about this, what you understand about this. I mean, knowledge really is power. But Dee, what would you have us go do?
Well, with the caveat that there are no easy solutions, but an action that I am trying to take personally and professionally is having discussions between and among white folks about slavery. Uh, I think it's we,
Mm.
white folks, particularly white privileged folks. Look, I got a scholarship to Harvard and set my foot on some of the most privileged white ground imaginable for 4 years, uh, and have benefited greatly from that legacy. And at the same time, was unaware for a long time about just where that white privilege came from and what a kind of phony premise it is when all is said and done. Uh, so I think that having conversations between and among white people about white supremacy, its negative effects on America, what it's doing to us as a nation, what it does to us as people, uh, what a hollow concept race really is.
Mm.
Uh, so that's for me where the action is. I don't know to what degree I'll be able to make a dent and all that, but that's kind of my posture, and I encourage other uh, whites who read this book to consider that as a potential direction of action to take.
I think that's exactly the direction we need to go. We've got to talk to each other and find a way to sort of heal what we've been afraid to approach. And I think Mars gives us great fodder for being able to even approach, because it gives us the breadth and the depth of the complexity. It doesn't hide from the ugliness, but it allows us to approach it in a way that we can begin to understand it. So, Dee, I think again a remarkable work. Thank you for taking time with me today, audience. I'm gonna say again, you got to get Mars, a psychological portrait of the Southern slave master and his legacy of white supremacy, by H.D. Kirkpatrick, who has been our guest. Thank you so much. And I will say to
May I add something, Lisa?
yes, yes, please.
If anybody wants, before they commit to buying it, they want to read some reviews, there are 7 or 8 pretty informative reviews on Amazon.
Oh, fantastic. So, but I'm giving you the review. So you
Okay.
don't read the Amazon reviews, but I'm telling you right now, this is a piece of work you're going to want for your library for sure. You're going to take it in. We're going to go into conversation, and you're going to have it on your in your library. The cover alone, I always mess with the camera. The cover alone is one that just makes you pause and really think. So it's a must read. So looking forward, I thank you again for taking the time, and audience, until next time, I'm Dr. Lisa Toppin. You've been listening to Inputs to Action. We'll see you next time. Thank you.